Hello and welcome to the first part in the series of videos that we're going to be looking at the decline of this once great country called Great Britain. So my name's Reverend Steve Chriscole. I'm the leader of the Knights Templar Church, but today isn't going to be a religious or Christian specifically talk. The idea is that I'm trying to provide information that I have learned over an extended number of years to pass on to other Christians who and anyone actually who so that people might be informed better about what is going on around them, because so many people seem not to be really very well informed. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this series of videos is I'm going to look at the various elements that contribute to have contributed and still contribute to the decline of Britain. Now, okay, I speak for myself when I say that confusion has reigned in my life for too long. You know, for a very long time I've struggled to try and make sense of the craziness that I've experienced around me, living in a country that seems to be imploding, you know, and the powers that be just seem oblivious to the problems, and all of that's left me quite nonplussed, really. So what I've done is I've worked hard to try and gain some sort of perspective, a different perspective, and learn from as many sources as possible about the vast array of problems that face Britain. So I'm not going to try and provide solutions. I wish I could, to these problems. I've already stated in the introductory video that I did on this subject that there is only one solution, and that is that the nation as a whole has got to turn back to God. That's the solution. From there, all things will happen, thanks to God's grace. So until then, let's dig in and try and make some sense of, well, the debacle that is facing Great Britain. So let's start with, anyone with eyes to see can see that Britain has some very serious problems, many of which I touched on in the introductory video. Those of us who are old enough can remember a Britain that, well, functioned well, and was a pleasant place to live. In fact, it was a very nice place to live. Now, I grew up in as a child, grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s, and I suppose the way I look at it is I think of these 2 decades as being the last years that I call real Britain. The rot really started to appear during the early 1970s, but my experience, you know, I didn't notice that being a teenager at the time. I only sort of felt the effects much later, in the 1980s. So what was it that was changing in those years? Well, of course, I was a child growing up, and I wasn't aware of the changes at that time, and like all kids, we were focused on school and girls and whatever hobbies and pastimes we had. So it's looking back in hindsight with that benefit that, you know, when you look back from today and having learned a lot of what went on that I just learned, I ignored as a child. Well, so what have I learned? Well, let's just say the first thing I learned about is the effect of the hippie movement in the 1960s. It's a little bit vague for me because it was when I was very young, but it sort of kind of contributed to a certain amount of social unrest. Now, that movement, it came to us from the United States, and basically it was about, there's no rules, there's a commune type of attitude where everybody did their own thing, and everybody accepted that, and no holds barred, free love, etc., etc., all of that. You might call it some people might call it a utopian ideology, kind of like the epitome that socialism aimed for. But of course, you know, such a radical view of life that was just for the few. But unfortunately, it left its participants with strong leftist views, although they may not have understood that at the time. But they were going to colour what was to come. See, prior to the 1960s, Britain was still struggling to recover from World War II. Cities needed rebuilding, and the infrastructure of the country also needed rebuilding. Well, yeah, there was new technologies coming along, you know, electronics and different things, but it was more to do with attitudes that were changing. There was something about starting to recover some of the energy that was lost as a result of the war. I just think that people were trying to heal from personal losses during the war, and there was a lot of that. Well, they say, don't they, that time is a great healer, and well, that's true to an extent. But the pain of loss of so many loved ones, it's really hard to bear. So, just to give you an example, I knew an old lady, a very old lady. She was in her 80s. She sat in her living room every day. I went to visit her. Now, she had a photograph on the mantelpiece. Well, actually, it was on a table next to her chair in the living room, and this photo was of her husband, and he was in an RAF uniform. He was killed in a Lancaster bomber during the middle of the war. Now, I knew her in the 2000s, and she was still staring at this photograph every day, missing him. She never remarried. And such are the long-lasting scars of war. See, rationing of food and everything, that ended finally in 1954, 9 years after the war had ended. So they'd had 15 years worth of, well, pretty much almost starving, but not quite. Shopping for food was now no longer a chore. Small supermarkets began to sort of emerge. Corner shops were doing a boom in trade, upsurge in trade, So things seemed to be improving by the early to mid-60s, and there was a sense of optimism in the air, I think, that's been, well, it was sorely missing over the previous 2 decades. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, because the youth of the 50s and the 60s especially were becoming increasingly restless. And, well, there was a kind of significant gap between the older generation and the new. The young people of the 50s, they found outlets in new music styles, and cultural groups began to form around these styles. So in Britain you got the skinheads, who were basically I would call them thugs. They were kind of what we would call today white supremacists, and very little, if any, tolerance for any group other than themselves. And so that they were notorious for violent behaviour. Then there was the mods and the rockers. This was sort of delineated by music and their choice of transport. So the mods would have their scooters, the rockers would have their motorbikes, and whenever they got together there was violence. Usually nobody knew why, except they just didn't like each other very much. But, violence in the streets again, and usually at the seaside resorts when they're on a weekend holiday or something. But if I was going to put my finger on a common theme in all of that, it would be probably a huge dissatisfaction with the prospect of living a life that they saw as the shackles of life that they saw of that in their parents and their grandparents, of this dishevelled society that was still apparent, really, from the remnants of World War II. You see, even I remember areas of Liverpool, even in the mid-1970s, areas of Liverpool having to be completely demolished because they just hadn't been repaired, or not repaired properly, since the Second World War, since the bombings. So this wartime bombing had devastated the countries like Coventry, having to be totally rebuilt. So the youth were kind of rebelling against what they saw as kind of controlling Victorian attitudes, out of date. But actually, this is where we can start to see a new generation of youngsters who are actually rejecting God in favour of, well, just pleasing themselves. And it was about pleasure. The music, the freedom, unshackled, doing what they wanted, having that freedom, well, that's liberating, isn't it? So in their eyes, what they were doing was they were breaking the mould and setting themselves free from a society they viewed as being, well, oppressive, restrictive, like that. So what we had was a generation that was emerging that would be highly receptive to the idea of social change. Now you might wonder where I'm going with all of this, given the title of today's lecture or talk, but just bear with me, okay? Because we're heading there now. You see, this social change that they seem to be heading into, this is why socialism has taken hold. You see, we saw the beginnings of these socialist ideas from Bevan, when with the instigation, is it 1948, when the National Health Service was formed? Wholly socialist in its attitude and approach to healthcare. Well, okay, but it wasn't banging the drum of communism or anything like that. It was just trying to be helpful to the social welfare of people. You know, everyone was entitled to the same treatment, and there were no costs involved to the man on the street. Just a small contribution in your salary, you know, and they called that national insurance. And of course there were also some other benefits as well. We had unemployment benefits, and there was a national state pension that was set up, and the promise that you put in with your national insurance and you pay your taxes all the years until you retire, and then you're going to get a pension. Wonderful. So this was kind of the new socialist Britain. It was a shift away from, well, the youth would say, the unfair lives of the old times, where decent healthcare was really there for people who had money in their pocket, and the prospects in old age were pretty bleak. So socialism was generally viewed in those days in the light that it was a way of providing help for those people in need. It was benevolent in nature, or so it was portrayed anyway, and it gave a sense of hope to that the country was moving in a new and better direction. So this view of socialism, it seemed to fit in with the British way of life as well, which was always being somewhat conservative. Business, we'd always believed in fair play, and socialism seemed to give that fair play to everyone. The same kind of treatment in the hospitals for everyone. It provided a balance against what definitely the oppressive corporate attitudes from much earlier in the century, where business owners really did take advantage of workers, and then the formation of unions started to put a stop to that. But it was the workforces, for them, for those in charge, the people who owned the businesses, they were a necessary evil, essentially. They were a drain on the resources and profit. Yeah, but lurking beneath the surface was something very sinister. You see, all was not as it seemed with this socialism. Now I want to move on. So that's just giving you a little bit of background to kind of the development of life in Britain during the 20th century, leading into the 21st. There is something that we need to talk about now, which is quite important. Just briefly, we'll talk about it, and that is the advent of the European Economic Community. Now don't worry, don't switch off. I'm not going to start talking about economics and stuff like that, but we do need to know about it, all right? Because in the 60s, the late 60s and early 70s, certain individuals were talking about the formation of this collective community of economic sharing. So the idea was of nations would work together to assist each other in a common market. That was the phrase that we tended to use in those days. This is called the common market. And it was always pitched to us as, pitched to the public, as being an economic benefit, where goods could be bought and sold within participating countries, and that would keep the prices down and availability high for everybody, and so on like that. Now on the face of it, that sounded great. But the problem was they weren't telling us the whole truth. The EEC, as it's officially known, was simply the first step in the formation of what we now know today as the European Union. Essentially, they lied to the public, and that's not an exaggeration. Our own Prime Minister at the time was Ted Heath. Actually, I've seen the letter that he wrote, which said that there is no way, that this is a benefit for Britain, and there will be no effect on British sovereignty. That was what the lie that he told the public, and it was a lie. Why lie? Well, because ultimately the plan was always to take sovereignty away from member nations and create a federal nation of Europe where you had unelected people in charge and all sorts of mechanisms to control the various nations and so on and so on. There's a lot of detail involved in all of that. Now, I don't want to say too much more about this, but I mention it because the roots of that whole deception stems from socialist ideology. But the thing is, you might ask, okay, Steve, well, but what flavour of socialism was it? Yeah, was it the Marxist variety of the Soviet Union, or was it the remnants of National Socialism from Germany and from Italy? You know, Mussolini, Hitler, and all of that. Now, what has emerged today, it kind of gives us a better picture. What do we have? We have a union of nations where individual sovereignty and the judiciary is overruled by of individual nations. That is overruled by European Union overlords. They have set up a court system, which is the European court system, and so on and so on. They've created laws by the bucket load, which everyone must comply with who's a member state. So the hierarchy, they're all unelected and cannot be removed by voting. So therefore, there is no democracy whatsoever within the EU. But they, even recently, with a speech given by the response to a speech given by the Vice President of the USA, J.D. Vance, the response from German, I think he was the German Vice Chancellor, I think, said, "How dare he say such things? We are we are fully democratic in the European Union." But no, you're not, because first of all, national heads can be removed essentially by the European Union. The European officials themselves, the EU, cannot be removed. That is not democracy. When voting is essentially useless, then where is the democracy in that? And we find that today we find an ever-tightening grip on the freedoms of the populations. Britain managed to escape to some extent in 2016 by Brexit, by leaving the European Union, in theory. But the European Union have been imposing strict codes of speech, and criticism of the government is deemed as illegal in some places, yes, punishable by imprisonment. So what are these people? The ones who are in prison, they're political prisoners, aren't they? And add to them those people who are deemed to be outspoken. They're silenced by various means, either prison or some form of societal cancelling. Now, there's more we could say about the EU. There's a lot we could say more about the EU and Britain today, but I just want this to help us to decide on the type of socialism that we're subject to. And the answer to that is actually it's a mixture of both National Socialism and Marxism. Now, someone, I don't know who it was, coined the phrase to call it commutarianism. Well, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it does, when you break it down, it describes the ideology. It's neither one nor the other, but it's both, elements of both, combined with the label, the lie, that it is in fact democracy, when it isn't. So, of course, as I've said, you get the idea this is very far from being democratic. When member states they've got no national elections, well, they have them, but they can be banned if the EU don't like the way the results are going. So today the title of this today is about the rise of cultural Marxism. But all of this preamble is leading up to, as it's important background, so that we can understand the attitudes and behaviour of states and rulers and the people up to this point. See, since the 1960s, there's been a significant push to re-educate those people in positions of power. They were the first targets because they needed to get people on board, and this was happening in Britain. See, these people that were being re-educated, well, they didn't realize that they were being re-educated. They thought that they were doing something special and extraordinary. And they weren't necessarily politicians, although some of them were, lots of them were, but you've got business magnates, you've got senior civil servants, you've got senior police officers, or in fact anybody who, and everyone that could be indoctrinated with methods that were, as they call it, and I'll tell you who they are in a minute, they were operating out of the box. That was their idea. Yeah, and that box being conventional thinking. So one of the major players in this re-education is a so-called charity, yes, a charity called Common Purpose. Now you might have heard of them before. They don't get talked about in mainstream media. Yes, nobody mentions them at all. They are mentioned on certain YouTube channels like UK Column and others. But it's gone very quiet because they've done the damage over 20-30 years. They've done the damage already. Now the CEO of Common Purpose was a woman by the name of Julia Middleton. Now she came straight from the training grounds of manipulative psychology, NLP, that's neuro-linguistic programming, and also she came from Europe, from Marxist teachings in Europe. So you can see what's in her head to formulate the creation of Common Purpose. And the title gives you a clue, doesn't it? Common Purpose. Everybody striving for the same thing. But anyway, so they build this thing as leadership and governance development. Okay, so and another thing, that one of the things that is really sketchy is the fact that Common Purpose, even today, they forbade any course members to ever discuss what they've done in their training. That is a bit suspicious, isn't it? So essentially, it was a kind of secretive organization. They were a charity. They've got a website. They still have today, but they keep under wraps what it is that they teach. So what did they teach? Well, alternative views on how to manage and how to lead, but no one was allowed to know. No one outside was allowed to know what those methods were. So what we see now, and whether it's connected to that, I think it is connected to that, but what we begin to see by the late 1980s, there's already a beginning of a new kind of ideology forming somewhere in the background. And it was a move, the stirrings of it was this move to change and to moderate the words that we speak. It started off fairly innocuously, but and of course these things do, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But things like sexual discrimination laws were brought in, of course, and so the feminist movement they forced us to move away from words that discriminated against women. Now, to a large extent, I can understand that, and I agree with it, but it was the beginning of the, shall we say, the alteration, the changes that were going to take place in the English language. So, for example, just one example, a fireman becomes a firefighter. He's not a man anymore because you can have fire women. Yeah, so they changed it to firefighter. Okay, policeman, policewoman, police officer. You get the idea. Head teacher, yes. Headmaster, headmistress, no. Okay, even if you had a headmaster, you had to be called head teacher. So these are the subtle, maybe not so subtle changes. Now you apply that to the whole English language and we see a massive shift in speech control. Because it didn't just stop there. This was just the beginning. A minority of people who determined to impose their will on the majority population. Now this and kind of many other changes started to occur, and that then moved on into the 1990s, where we started to hear the phrase politically correct. What does that mean? Well, it was used to describe the way that we are supposed to speak, so that we don't offend either minorities, or we don't sexually discriminate or whatever. So we're sanitizing our language so that we're being nice and not offending other people. That's the way it was pushed initially, and that's the way it's been pushed for years. And so gradually what's happening, of course, is that you're re-educating the public to believe that to speak this way is the right thing to do. Now, you're talking about the British public. The British people have, I don't know how long it's been, but we are a people who believe in doing the right thing. We're a Christian nation. We've been brought up in the ideology, if you like, of Christianity. And so that has been our kind of ethos, to do the right thing, to be charitable, to be fair. And so what this does is it takes advantage of the British psyche, essentially. And boy, you know, if those minorities identified a transgressor, they literally ripped their lives apart. Still do today. We call that cancel culture. And that's developed. It certainly wasn't a massive thing in the 1990s, but go forward 20 years or so, and then it really is a weapon. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. What was the underlying motivation for these changes? Well, it follows the principle of the story of the boiling frog. You may know that one. It's you put a live frog in a pot of water and then gradually heat it up. Now, the frog accepts, you know, the fact it's in water. It likes water. That's happy. It's happy in water. And it doesn't really care too much about the change in the temperature. I'm happy in the water. It's very nice until the water boils and the frog's dead. It took a while for it to die. It didn't notice the gradual increase of temperature. See, it's that slow boiling approach that the Marxists have employed to deliberately undermine British society over an extended number of years. Not just years, but decades. Yeah? But who are these Marxists? Who are they? Well, I can't give you names, particularly, but take it from me, they're there. They are the hardcore communists who, they've kind of recognized that the Soviet Union failed. Oh yes, believe me, Britain did have its fair share of communists. They may have kept themselves quiet during the Cold War, but they were there, believe me. So they saw how the Soviet Union's way of dealing with things didn't work out, and they sort of 1980, 89, I can't remember the exact date of when the wall came down in Berlin, the 90s, the early 90s, Soviet Union falls apart, or is dismantled. It failed basically, and the idea of communism was kicked into touch. So these Soviets, I'm not saying that the people are Russian spies or anything. No, you only just have to look at what happened in the Soviet Union. If you're British, you lived in this country, but you're a communist, you'll be looking at that and go, yeah, okay. So what do we do then? We want to be able to enforce or apply our ideology. How do we do it? Boil the frog. They embarked on this gradual transformation of British and European society into one that conformed into sociological communist ideology. See, Stalin, the leader of the Communist Union of the USSR for a long time, he failed with his murderous approach. He murdered so many of his own people. But he created the communist bloc, and now defeating the capitalists is going to be done by boiling the frog. So the method of killing 60 million of your own people kind of had a bit of a detrimental effect, you would agree. So now, and I'm speaking specifically about Britain, I'm not going to talk about Europe in this. For everybody in Britain, for many years now, has had to modify their language. This is just the beginning, by the way, okay? They've had to modify their language to make sure that they don't fall foul of this great sin called causing offence. And all this is happening in parallel to this gradual creation of the European Union that I talked about before, of which at that time, since 1975, Britain became a member. It was, I think, the Maastricht Treaty of, well, I'm not very good with dates, was it somewhere in the late 90s or mid 1990s, was signed, and that's when we signed away, I think it was the end of the 90s, we signed away our sovereignty. That was it. The Queen was no longer in charge. British government was beholden to the European Union. So now, we're a nation in chains. We could go into a lot of detail about that. We can talk about these things in another video because our time is limited. All I've said has in very recent years, perhaps in the last 8 to 10 years, intensified to a huge degree. We've had as I said, the slow boiling frog has brought into being hate speech laws which now codify and allow the police to be able to arrest you and charge you if you say something that hurts someone else's feelings. And believe me, the police are going at this great guns. That's another subject for another day. Real crimes go unattended, but you say something wrong or whatever and the policemen are knocking on your door. Now this new ideology, this thing that's been simmering away, has gradually come to the surface. A bit like, you know, when you're making steel, the scum does float to the surface. Well, the scum in this case certainly has, and it's called woke. Again, we're going to spend some time talking about this in another video, but the people who follow this woke ideology, which uses political correctness as a weapon and cancellation culture as a weapon and a number of other things, they operate it, it's like a religion, and they literally are enforcing people to comply with it. So what does it consist of? Well, we'll just briefly say it consists of the things I've already mentioned, but it also consists of a thing called DEI. That's diversity, equity and inclusion. I remember a short stint I had in the prison service where I had to undergo my I'll call it indoctrination training, or my induction training is what I meant to say, where I had to go through some of that training. And I've got to say it was a very strange experience, but there you go. This DEI, it's wrought havoc everywhere it's implemented. So what does it mean? Diversity. In short, it means accepting multiculturalism, so that we're all a diverse nation of different colours and cultures and so on. Equity, not equality. Equity. There's a big difference. Yeah, equity seeks to redistribute wealth and the opportunities so that minority groups have just as much opportunity as everybody else, accessing the same as everybody else. You can see that there's a disparity there because the minority groups are that big and the majority people are that big, but they want a bigger slice of the pie. So somebody's going to suffer. Redistribution. Does that sound a bit communist to you? And then there's inclusion. Well, it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is, what your ideological or religious beliefs, everybody must be included. So if you want to get a job, something close to my heart that's happened in the Royal Air Force, I'm ex-military, I'm ex-Air Force, how a number of years ago the Air Force said, well, we're not going to take on board any more white male pilots. What we want is diversity, and we want everybody to be included. So they got women to come in and become fighter pilots, and different people, you know, and so on and so on, different creeds and what have you. But what they find is, and I'm not going into details here, today we're kind of on the brink, possibly, of World War III with Russia. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And the Air Force are finding that they're short of pilots now, because the recruitment that they set up hasn't worked. Because it was very, very hard to find somebody with the correct ability to learn how to fly a modern jet fighter and happen to be gay at the same time. There's not many of them about. Okay, so you get the idea. That's inclusion. We've got to include everyone. And I think you can probably see that DEI, when you stick it all together, is a cultural disaster. But it's being forced on us because it's the right thing to do. See? Well, in fact, it's the exact opposite, of course. It actually causes huge divisions in society, the dumbing down of society, and a lot more. Okay, so this is woke. This is the woke attitude, which has infected much of the country's hierarchy and populace, for that matter. Now, we can talk about that in more detail another time. It does warrant its own video, really. Now, there are some more ridiculous ideas abound, things like critical race theory. This is another one that the wokes love. Deeply racist, but only against white people. It's an ideology that paints everything that a white man does or says, either today or in history, as being racist. Yeah. But perhaps it's the least spoken about issue is how society overall today is in a state of paralysis. Paralysis. What do we mean? Well, these factors that I've talked about, I've been discussing today, what they do, they become so entrenched in public psyche that every last one of us, and I've been guilty of it as well. I used to work for a number of years in the education system in England, and not as a teacher. I have done teaching, but in that case I was a technician working, going through a lot of schools in a particular county, and visiting and talking to head teachers and blah blah blah. So I picked up quite a lot of information there, so I was involved, and I had no choice but to use the head teacher business. Okay. Now, I mean, the people are so, like I said, they're so entrenched. Everybody is aware of the consequences of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And this is exactly the point, isn't it? This is the purpose of all the manipulation of attitudes and language. And the idea is to bring the population under control. Use fear of cancellation, of imprisonment, as the motivator. All right. Now, the net effect of that is exactly the same. And if you do your studies, you're conscientious about it, you do your studies and you see what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, you will see it is exactly what the Germans did, or should I say the National Socialists did within Germany. Exactly the same. But you can say the same thing, but in a slightly different flavour, about the population control in the Soviet Union. They just went about it in a different way. A more robust, more... it's very hard to say, really. The threat of death was very much prominent. The gulags and the prospect of being sent to Siberia. Yeah, no. So, essentially, these two things, these two areas, they're just two strands of the same broom. Now, in Britain today, the fear of transgressing is being rammed home even further, I should say. I mentioned about the speech of President Vance to the European Union Security Council only a few weeks ago from when I record this, and he laid out the problem. And he said that the security threat is not from outside. He said a few other things. The security threat's not from the outside, it's from the inside, it's from within. He went on to speak about the suppression of free speech within that he'd noticed in the European nations. Well, needless to say, the Europeans did not like it at all. It didn't go down at all well. But the rest of the world was clapping their hands vigorously. At last, somebody has pointed out the problem. So perhaps now we can maybe just see why things continue to get worse in Britain. Does no one else see what's happening? Well, yes, of course. Many people do. But the consequences of speaking out are very severe. You could lose your job. You will lose your job. You could lose everything that you have worked for, your bank account, Banks will close accounts if they deem you to be what you might call an undesirable. If you get called a racist, a xenophobic, Islamophobic, homophobic, misogynistic, and there's a long list of those. If you get called any of those, that's you done. You are done, finished. And when it comes to those people who govern us, the parliamentarians, the MPs, not military police, that's members of parliament, they literally sit on their hands and do nothing. And I'm not exaggerating. And they do that for the same reasons as the rest of the population. The fear of being labelled, and you can just pick your own label, whichever you want. It's just so severe, and it would impact their livelihood severely. Let's face it, if you get cancelled, you're no longer going to receive that nice salary and all those benefits you get as an MP, and it's a lot. So their inaction and silence is the best. They see it as the best option. Well, at least for them, anyway. So the politicians are useless to bring about any change. And you add to the problem the civil service, which has been infiltrated by leftist progressives. They've literally taken over any number of government departments. Their thinking is dominated by the compliance with woke ideology. Now, many of them don't agree with that, I'm sure, but they're petrified of stepping outside their tightly defined boundaries, social boundaries. Ministers take their directions from these woke overlords, and woe betide them if they wander from their script. Do you think this is far-fetched? Well, it isn't. I'm going to mention something now that will show you that it's not far-fetched. See, one of the inner circle of British government advisors, a gentleman by the name of Dominic Cummins, he has whistleblown on the situation, and he said exactly what I've just said. The civil service run the government. The ministers are largely pawns to be shuffled around as necessary. Therefore, they all, bar a couple, sing from the same hymn sheet. So if somebody gives a brief to the Prime Minister, that's what he enforces. Now, of course, there is a certain amount of freedom, as the current Prime Minister is proving. He's been making decisions apparently he's been making decisions without informing the Parliament, and it's not going well for him, I tell you, because he's just been acting as if he's a dictator. See, nothing changes, does it? There's new leftist policies that are coming in left, right and centre, and they're passed, and the grip of the freedom of the populace grows even tighter. So let's wind this up for today. How have we allowed ourselves to get into this mess? Well, the answer's simple, really. We've been hoodwinked. We've been lied to. There's a slow march of communism. It began way back in the 1920s, actually, when a group of Marxists got together in Frankfurt University in Germany, and they formulated this concept of cultural Marxism. Okay, the teaching was when they were Jews, as I remember, and with the onset of we don't like the Jews, they left Germany, went to the United States, so it was exported there, and then after the war they fled back to Germany and what have you, and basically it was also transported because they got quite a few followers. Some of those people then exported cultural Marxism in the 1960s to, guess where? My country, Britain. British shores received it. Well, nobody knew, because they weren't supposed to know, that this is the biggest scam ever perpetrated on the British people, that they were being played, and it was a long, long time in its creation and its fruition. But today, that frog that is Britain is almost boiled. We have now Marxists in 10 Downing Street, as I speak. Their policies are literally tearing this country to pieces. And they're telling us that they're doing us good. And it seems like there's nothing we can do to stop them. They ignore the people when they protest and ride roughshod over those people who disagree with their policies, such as they are. Now we're going to have to endure this until the next national election cycle in 2029, and even then there is no guarantee that we can overcome this. Maybe now hopefully you can see why I chose this topic to begin this conversation about the darkness that we face. It's because of this insipid, insurgent social coup, which is what it is, that Britain faces its darkest days since 1940. So there's more to talk about. So please join me in the next lecture that we talk about. More issues that are causing Britain to be a dark place. So try not to be depressed, and we'll see you next time. God bless. See you then.